Okay, so one of the questions I keep getting is, where did restorative justice come from? What is the history? Is it something new? Is this something that we've been doing for a while? So I thought I'd do an episode on the history of restorative justice as part of my RJ webinar series. So welcome to another episode. Today I'm going to briefly go through, very briefly, the history of restorative justice as I see it and as I have published it in several papers, in chapters and in books, and I'll put some references on this video and under the description so that you can follow up. So restorative justice. So I want to differentiate two things: the actual name of restorative justice and the actual practice, and what restorative justice represents. And I've spoken many times, and there's a couple of episodes of this webinar series on the definition of restorative justice and where I sit with it, dismissing definitions and the need for definitions for restorative justice. But I won't cover that in this episode. I want to look at the history and also at the name of restorative justice, which I claim to date as back as the ancient Greek civilizations. And in fact, Aristotle made direct reference to restorative justice using the exact words επανορθωτική δικαιοσύνη, which means restorative justice in Greek. So if you look at his work, the Ethics, for example, he makes reference to distributed justice, to restorative justice, to the virtue of justice and distinguishing it from fairness. And therein you will see the ingredients that he describes that the restorative justice has as a model and as a method of addressing conflict and bringing fairness and balance in societies. Obviously, societies at the time were very different from the societies that we're experiencing today. But hey-ho, the teachings of Aristotle and many other philosophers are not obsolete, and they're not attached to times and places. I claim that the roots of restorative justice, and in fact its very name, can be found in Aristotelian writings. And references will come up for your writings and your research. So what happened then? So if restorative justice dates as back as Aristotle, and in fact there are different references of where restorative justice was used in ancient Greek, but also in other places. For example, in Eskimos, and even the Code of Hammurabi, which dates even before Aristotle, makes references to practices, not so much the name restorative justice, but practices that represent restorative justice. Homer spoke about Achilles, for example, who said in relation to Agamemnon's death, that it can even the death of a brother can be balanced and restored, not so much through capital punishment, but through restoration and a different kind of justice. And in those testimonies and in those historical documents, we see the practice of restorative justice as a top-down and state-inflicted method of pursuing justice. And if you've read my work, I have nothing against the law or state processes, state-led processes of pursuing justice. That, of course, doesn't mean that we can't look into and investigate other forms of delivering justice. And restorative justice is exactly that, is another form of delivering justice, which is not led by an authority. It is led by the parties or their communities. And surprise, surprise, when communities were a lot more powerful in societies, and the reasons varied because, for example, there was no state, or there was no authority in the form of a king or a ruler or a president or a parliament, then because organically communities will lead on the affairs of the community and the aggregation, then by default restorative justice will be used as a method for addressing conflict and restoring peace. So it's no shock, and it shouldn't be a shock, when we say that restorative justice dates us back as the first human, not Greek civilizations, but the first human civilizations, because if we felt the need to come together as humans, that creates a knock-on effect of living together, and living together is not always a joyful experience. It also may lead to conflicts and issues, which we now call crimes or antisocial behavior. So how would we restore that? By coming together as communities, by coming together in different forms, on a one-to-one basis, on a group basis, on a circle basis. And that is why you have different restorative justice practices, what we call today restorative justice practice or restorative practices, dating so back, reaching all sorts of civilizations across continents, and without any geographical barriers. So that's kind of the origins, if you like, of restorative justice. So what happened then, and why is today the exception, and we kind of feel that, oh my God, it's such a jazzy new little thing that, you know, people that don't like the criminal justice system are introducing. The big change happened during the Middle Ages. And why did the big change happen in the Middle Ages? Because that is where, and of course, it's a big chronological period, and I'm not covering every single aspect here of what happened between, you know, the before Christ and Middle Ages. I have papers on this, which, as I said, will become available. But what was the main thing that happened during the Middle Ages was a huge shift from the way that the affairs of the communities were managed and controlled. And that was the creation of the kingdoms and, of course, the rise of authorities, including religious authorities, the church, and so on. So once those kingdoms and those powers of control were created, a knock-on effect was the creation of a system that would be controlled by those powers, whether it was the state, the kingdom, the king, the queen, the church, and so on. So the ecclesiastic powers, the state powers, would create their own ecclesiastic laws or state laws to deliver forms of justice through different methods, whether it would be the judiciary of the time or the different executives of the time, whether legitimate or not. And that is why we started seeing a shift in transitioning in how we were experiencing the delivery of justice and criminal justice. The parties were taken out of the picture, and the state or the powerful or the ruler will take control in the name of the parties and because they cared, whether genuinely or not, for the welfare of their kingdoms or their communities that they were there to serve. So that gradually became bigger and bigger, and obviously as democracies started to grow and become stronger, the legitimization of taking those processes away from the parties, who we can now call victims and offenders, were becoming more justifiable and accepted. And that went on, of course, until very recently, when we all started feeling that something was just not right with the way that those that we haven't trusted were delivering justice and criminal justice. And those questions actually started from the beginning of the 19th century and continued with different debates, mainly within academics, but also with policy forums and international bodies that, when victimology and criminology was developing, would reflect on other justice processes and not naming them as restorative justice, but referencing them and arguing in favor of them. Again, I will put references so that you can look into those authors and those presentations from those policy forums that were happening within the criminology field and the victimology field later on. So where is the kind of the modern version of restorative justice I found? Well, there are various claims, and as people want to, because they're still alive, they want to make a claim that I am this and I created RJ and I brought RJ back, or I created a restorative justice, or whatever it is. So you have all sorts of things in the field. And for example, if you Google the Elmira case, which is a little village, Elmira is a little village in Ontario, Canada. I don't know how big it is now, but in 1974, when there is this claim that a case happened, vandalism by two teenagers, by two young people, the case, instead of sent to the normal kind of process of courts and prisons and punishment in the state form of punishment, was diverted to a kind of a form of restorative justice, as the probation officer thought it would be good for the two young people to be their victims. There's a lot of referencing of that case as kind of the first modern version of restorative justice. And there's no doubt that Canada is one of the countries that led kind of the modern version, or the return of restorative justice, if you like. Now, if there were better research studies, or in the future, when we look at other continents, in Africa and so on, we might be able to trace other cases that were before 1974. So, similarly, in the UK, for example, in the 70s, you had people like Martin Wright, who's actually one of my guests in the webinar series, and I'm asking him about the history, the present, and the future of restorative justice. And please watch that unique webinar with my guest. So practitioners and academics in the UK started writing about it, and a lot of cases started to appear, but nothing in a kind of formalized or structured or unstructured way. It was just on the back of mediation centers that were created in small neighborhoods. And from the 70s, we saw gradually a growing interest in restorative justice, mainly in countries where I would say the adversarial criminal justice system, and remember we have kind of two main criminal justice systems, the adversarial or the inquisitorial, or what we call common law and civil law justice systems. So adversarial, you would see countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, the US, the colonies, of course, whereas the inquisitorial would be countries such as the continent in Europe, so European countries, Germany, France, and so on, would have not so much engagement in the 90s or even in the early 2000 with restorative justice. And I would say that's because the adversarial or common law system, because of its more ad hoc development and nature, would allow the participation of the parties a lot easier in the criminal justice process than in the inquisitorial, which by default is an inquisitorial by the state inquisiting the truth for and on behalf of the parties. So I would say after 2004 and onwards, we saw a very, very rapid development of restorative justice. including Europe, where the interest, especially not just at the kind of national level, but at a regional level, including the Council of Europe and the European Commission, looked at passing recommendations and in the end included restorative justice in different directives, which, as you know, directives is a form of law, and in fact of higher law compared to national legislation of member states of the European Union. The same happened in countries like the US and Canada and Australia, where the practices of restorative justice developed not just within communities, but also within the formal justice system. And now we are now seeing countries merging or marrying the kind of unstructured and structured forms of restorative justice. And if you don't know what structured or unstructured forms of restorative justice is, the two models, the consensual models of restorative justice that I've been advocating, then it will come up on the screen, the reference of where you can find more information of what that means. So that's in brief the rise and fall, if you like, of restorative justice, dating as back as, the ancient civilizations, regulating how our affairs were managed and also how our conflicts were addressed, to today, where restorative justice appears in all shapes and forms and has come back. Now, I won't cover anything in relation to its future, and I've spoken about how I feel in relation to where we are going with restorative justice. I'm still studying restorative justice 22 years later, and that's the exciting bit, because restorative justice is innovative, is organic, is ever-changing, and whatever we do, it will continue, and that's because it's found in the little communities, and it's an organic reaction to what we feel as individuals and as communities, to a gap, bridging a gap that our justice system, the formalized justice system, and those that we have put in power are letting us down. And that's the organic reaction that we have without even realizing, and that is why restorative justice will continue in one shape or form. I hope you enjoyed this seminar, and looking forward to seeing you to the next one. Please do subscribe if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, and if you haven't checked out the RJ4All Sports channel, which is RJ4All's a new initiative that I created, believing in the power of sports. Please check it out and sign up, because there's plenty of new videos covering sports and how sports can be used for restorative justice and community cohesion. Thank you.